Hi, y'all. Welcome back. I'm Jen. I support wonderfully unconventional humans and polyamorous parents to lead deeply fulfilling lives. And I'm sorry if I sound a little hoarse. I'm fighting a cold, but I'm super fired up about this. So we're going to talk about it anyway. So we're here today to talk about decision making, and particularly when it feels like there's some big lifelong consequence hanging in the balance of a decision. This came about because I have a client who's struggling with, does she send her kid to school or does she homeschool? And the fate of her child's future feels like it's hanging in the balance. Like, is her child going to grow up to have a happy, fulfilling, healthy life? And that's a lot of pressure to put on that decision. So we're going to talk about how do you make a decision like that, um, and we're going to talk about those big consequences that feel like they're involved. We're going to really get into some philosophical stuff here. We're going to talk about Buddhism. We're going to talk about spirituality. We're going to talk about philosophy. And you don't have to agree with me on these things. That's fine. But I'm going to talk about how I see these things and how that applies to how I work with people to figure out what's right for them at any given moment. Because I think there's a lot of like philosophical underpinnings of how to make a decision like that. So um, the first thing that we're going to talk about, so I'm going to kind of use that example of the what to do about school just as a framework to talk about this, but this applies to like, do I go to college? Do I open up my marriage? Do I have kids at all? Do I move? All of these things that feel like big life decisions. And, sometimes it feels like a really clear yes to something. Sometimes there's a really clear, like, this decision feels right to everybody involved, and there's really no question. And sometimes it's kind of more like what my client's experiencing right now, where they feel like there's pros and cons to both options. Neither one feels like a utopia. And so it's there's some wrestling happening with like, what are the highest priorities here, and what do I use to make the decision based on when I can see positives and negatives to whatever decision I might make. And especially when it feels like there's this big, like, we're not just talking about like how am I going to feel about this decision today or next week, but how is my child going to feel about the decision that I made when 20 years from now. And like, sort of tangentially to this, another conversation that this client was involved in with a colleague of mine, where that colleague is struggling in a relationship with an adult child, and said something along the lines of, I thought I had done everything right to have a good relationship with my children, and now they're adults and we don't have a good relationship. And I can really feel the grief of that, of the like, but I did what I was supposed to. And I didn't get the outcome I wanted. So that's the first thing that we're going to talk about is outcomes. So what the thing that I hear in common about a lot of these kinds of decisions, where there is no clear, obvious yes path forward, at least not on like an intellectual pros and cons list kind of sense, that one of the things I hear a lot is this: I have an outcome in mind that is pretty far off, not like a tomorrow outcome, but like a, years from now outcome, like having a good relationship with my adult children. But I'm thinking about this while my children are toddlers, or that I'm thinking about like my child having a fulfilling career a decade or more in the future, or I'm thinking about, that I want to grow old with somebody and we just started dating. So, like, these far off projections of what we want the future to be like. And the first thing I want to do is really validate that, of course, you want your child to be happy and fulfilled. Of course, you want a healthy relationship with your children when they're adults. I want those things too. And it's natural and it's human, and everybody wants that. And I want that for you. And so this isn't about like not having the desire for that, but about untangling the reality. And the reality is that, first of all, the future's never guaranteed. So there's literally nothing that any of us can do that's going to guarantee a specific outcome in the future, especially when we're talking about another person or a relationship or something like that. And the second thing is that uh, even if you could somehow guarantee an outcome like that, something that's kind of ethereal and big, like feeling fulfilled in life, is something that would be the product of so many decisions that it's not possible for one decision that you make to be the thing that causes that to happen or to not happen. And for a lot of us that have been socialized as women, we've been socialized to not feel an enormous amount of agency over those things for ourselves or over our own lives and relationships and happiness and joy and fulfillment. And we've been socialized to believe that we have a lot of control, or that we're supposed to exert a lot of control over those things for other people, particularly children. And or that the way to achieve those things for ourselves is to exert that control, exert some kind of control over somebody else. And so for a lot of people who've been socialized as women, who've been socialized with those ideas of it's my job to make this outcome happen for my children, it can feel like a really big loss to confront the possibility that it might not actually be in your power to ensure any kind of outcome for your children, that's literally not possible for you to control, no matter how perfect of a parent you are, which you won't be perfect. I'm not perfect. We're all human. None of us are going to be perfect parents. And children don't need perfect parents in order to be happy and healthy and fulfilled in life. And no amount of achieving something close to perfection is going to guarantee or ensure that that result happens. So that's the first piece, is working through any kind of grief or loss, finding somebody to talk to about that if you need to, that goes along with the idea that that's not in your power, and starting to let go of the attachment to that outcome. And this is where some of the spiritual stuff comes in, because this is something that's talked about in Buddhism a lot. And this is what I believe the Buddha was talking about with the idea of all suffering comes from attachment. This is not attachment like you shouldn't care deeply about other people, that kind of attachment. This is attachment to a specific outcome, an attachment to a future state or a path or a result. Those kinds of attachments lead to suffering, because those kinds of things are not in our control, and they're in the future. They're not happening now. So we're trying to make decisions now, and the only validation that we've made the right decision is somewhere far off in the future. And so that brings us to this limbo place that could last for years, decades, depending on the decision, where you make a decision, or through inaction, you make a decision if you can't make up your mind to make a conscious decision. But then you don't find out whether or not that was a good decision for decades. And then by the time you get to the result place, if you don't get the result that you had been hoping for, it invalidates all of those decades that have happened since the decision. And that is a place that breeds a lot of anxiety and a lot of regret and a lot of pain. So that philosophical idea underpins a lot of the ways that I look at big life decisions. And the idea that since we can't guarantee an outcome at some point off in the future, we can only look at right now. And then the last piece before I turn into the looking at right now is that I want to say, when you work through the grief and loss that might be there with the idea of controlling the future, it can actually be kind of liberating once you get to the other side. It can be liberating because there isn't so much pressure on the decisions, and it can feel less um, weighty and stressful and anxiety inducing to make decisions. And it can also just free up a lot of presence for the present moment. And it also hands the agency to other people for their own lives. So, it allows me to believe that while I certainly have a huge impact and influence on my children, and that's really important for their development, ultimately, their satisfaction with their lives is in their hands. And that is both liberating for me, I'm not responsible for it, and it also gives them all of the agency, which is what most of us really want, is agency for our own lives and our own selves. It means if they're unhappy with something, instead of blaming me for it, they have the agency, especially as they become adults, to choose their own path and find their own happiness and make their own way. And that if I can be there as a guide and a facilitator to make that path easier, then that's my role. But ultimately, they are the owners and the responsible parties for their own lives. So then so all of those pieces are about like why we can't be focused on those long-term outcomes from the now decisions. So and that has to be the first step, is working through all of that, getting to that place of letting go of the future, because as long as we're clinging to that and holding on to that, we can't truly make a decision in present time that is about present time. So when we've gotten there, then we're going to talk about how do you make a decision like that in present time. And this is where a lot of the somatic work becomes really important. So I'm going to give you an exercise that's about feeling yes and no right now, and practice this, especially if you're not used to tuning into your body when you make decisions. Practice this on little, small, everyday decisions. Don't try to jump just immediately to the big life decisions, especially the ones that feel hard, because, as my client's experiencing, with a lot of those bigger decisions, there's both yes and no in all of the choices. And so sifting through those to make a decision can be more complex. So even with a lot of practice, this isn't something that necessarily happens instantly with big decisions. This is still something where there can be a process of sifting through the layers, and there might need to be some talking to somebody and like having a sounding board, getting some reflection. This is something, I've been doing this work. I've been supporting parents in this work for 5 years. It's been almost a decade that I've been doing this work for my own self. And I still, just a couple weeks ago, had a meeting with some colleagues and with my mentor, where I was working through the decision of whether or not to get a cat, right? Whether or not to get a cat is like so much less of a big decision than my child's future. And yet it was really helpful to just kind of talk through the like pros and cons and my fears and my concerns and get some reflection. And that helped to clarify for myself what I was feeling, what was really mine, what was stuff from my past, and be able to sit with that and make a more embodied decision. So I just want to say that there's not an expectation that this somehow becomes like, you just know what's right all the time about everything. So practice it first with things that are easy. So this practice of feeling a yes and a no in your body, I like to start this with food. And so I'm going to talk you through this, and then I would encourage you to actually go do this. Like, go get some foods and, sit down with them and like spend a couple of minutes actually doing this. So grab one of your favorite foods, something that is like, if that food is there, I want to eat it every single time. So for me, that's going to be a brookie, which is a chocolate chip cookie and a brownie combined. you could not keep me away from those if they're in front of me. And then on the other side, pick something that you absolutely cannot stand, like something that you might literally choose to just not eat if it's the only thing available to you to eat. So for me, that's going to be mushy, slimy eggplant. And have those two foods, put them on two different plates in front of yourself, and start with the yes food, and really interact with it without tasting it for at least a couple of minutes. Smell it, touch it, look at it, um, contemplate the idea of eating it. Imagine what it's going to taste like, how satisfying it's going to be, um, all of those things. Imagine all of that and feel what that's like inside your body. And this is why it has to be slow, because otherwise we tend to only feel this very surface level satisfaction. So you're feeling for like, what does it feel like in your chest or your rib cage? How is your breathing? Does your breathing slow down or get deeper? Or do you feel like anticipatory fluttering somewhere? Does something feel more open? What does it feel like in your stomach? What does it feel like in your shoulders and neck, your hands? These are all places that we tend to hold on to emotion in our bodies. What does it feel like in your jaw? So just noticing all of those things, and don't eat it yet. And now slide the plates after you've given yourself a couple minutes there and look at your no food. And similarly, smell it, touch it. If you can bring yourself to interact with it, don't eat it. But contemplate eating it. Imagine what it would be like to eat this thing and feel what that's like in your body. Does it feel like something's closing down or tightening? Does it feel like there's nausea coming up? Does it feel like there's closing? Does it feel harder to take a deep breath? What does that feel like in your body to imagine eating something that's clearly a no for you? And then go back to the yes food and give a couple of minutes at least to each of these, and go back and forth as many times as you need to start to feel a clear difference between yes and no. And then as you start to notice what's different, you can go back and forth a little faster and start to feel yes, no, yes, no. So go back and forth with this as many times as you need to start to feel like there's a clear, that's what yes feels like in my body, and that's what no feels like in my body. And then if you want, you can add tasting into the experience and see what that brings in your body, especially with the yes food. If you can bring yourself to taste the no food, that can give you a lot of information. But I also totally understand if it's such a no that you can't actually taste it. Don't, traumatize yourself. But give yourself a lot of time to play with the idea of yes and no. And then start bringing this familiarity with what yes and no feel like in your body into other minor daily decisions. What you're going to wear, maybe what you're going to eat for breakfast, among things that are all kind of generally yes, but something might be more what you're in the mood for today, what music you're going to listen to, things that have no real consequence in your life, but where you can play with that idea of like, oh, what feels like more of a yes to my body right now? And gradually start to bring this to decisions with more consequence. And then when it comes to the really big decisions, again, support, really, really important, especially if you're new to this. But even if you have a lot of experience with it, the bigger the decision, the harder it is to hold all of the factors by yourself. Journaling can be helpful to help sort through some of those things as well. But the same idea, instead of bringing a sense of like what feels like a yes for this long-term outcome that I'm hoping and wishing for, what feels like a yes right now? What's in alignment and congruence with who I am, with what my values are now? And when you can make decisions now that are in alignment with the things that you most value and the person that you most want to be now, whatever outcome comes out of that, first of all, that tends to lead to good outcomes, or at least it tends to point in the direction of good outcomes, because when we live in alignment with ourselves, generally speaking, we continue to live in alignment with ourselves if we continue to reinforce those patterns and those practices. And so we'll tend to end up, as much as is in our own control, we'll tend to end up in places that are in alignment. And, you know, also there's the reality of forces that are beyond our control in society and in the world, and accidents and things like that. So there are pieces that are beyond our control that are going to happen whether or not we make decisions in alignment with ourselves. But when we can make the decisions that are really in alignment with ourselves and who we are and where we are right now, then whatever the outcome ends up being decades down the line, we are better equipped to deal with that outcome if it's a negative one. And we are better equipped to really embody the joy of it if it's a positive thing. And we're also better equipped to navigate and grieve and move forward if there's challenges. And that's because there's less of the layers of grief and regret, and all of that was wasted when there's a sense of, yeah, I really genuinely did my best and showed up in alignment with my true self all the way along. And so here I am, and what am I going to do with that? Um, so that that's where I want to leave you. Wherever you go from that, whether you work with me or not, I want to leave you with that. It starts with now. And the only way that we can ever get to a place that feels good decades down is to start with now, and with bringing really deep alignment with our values and ourselves now. So, if you have questions, you feel free to reach out. If you feel like you could use some support with figuring out how to do that in your own life, reach out, because this is what I do. I'm very passionate about it, and I look forward to supporting you and connecting with you on your journey to a more fulfilling life.